The dust of FOB Phoenix settled on everything, a fine, pale grit that coated skin, weapons, and the very air people breathed. It was a temporary place trying desperately to be permanent, a collection of HESCO barriers and plywood huts baking under an unforgiving Afghan sun. To Captain Eva Rostova, it felt like a dozen other forward operating bases she had known, yet somehow softer, its edges dulled by a command climate that prized appearance over reality. Her introduction to that climate came on her first day, standing in a stuffy, air-conditioned command tent with a handful of other new arrivals. Colonel Marcus Thorne, commander of the task force, paced before them. He was a man sculpted by ambition, his uniform immaculate, his posture ramrod straight. He moved with the sharp, aggressive energy of a man who believed his own speeches. "Welcome to the tip of the spear," he announced, his voice booming in the enclosed space. He went down the line, giving each soldier a firm handshake and a clipped, motivational phrase. When he reached Eva, he barely paused, his eyes flicking over the captain's bars on her collar and the nurse corps insignia. "And this is Captain Rostova," he said, addressing the room more than her. "Our new head nurse for the role too. Keep the ibuprofen and the bandages stocked, Captain. We like to keep our warriors in the fight, not on sick call." A few of the junior officers chuckled. Eva's expression didn't change. She met his gaze with a steady, neutral calm that seemed to unnerve him for a fraction of a second. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice even and low. The dismissal was clear. She wasn't a warrior. She was a support function, a manager of minor aches and pains. In his eyes, she was just a nurse. She spent the next 2 weeks in quiet observation, a ghost in sterile scrubs moving through the controlled environment of the aid station. The facility, a rigid-walled shelter connected to the main command building, was a testament to Colonel Thorne's philosophy. It was pristine. Floors were bleached, supplies were inventoried to the last suture, and every piece of equipment gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was perfect for an inspection. It was a death trap for a mass casualty event. The trauma bays were arranged according to a textbook diagram that prioritized neatness over workflow. Critical supplies like chest tubes and tourniquets were stored in locked cabinets at the far end of the room, requiring a key and precious seconds to access. The primary triage area was cluttered with administrative desks. The junior medics, most on their first deployment, were diligent and well-read. They could recite protocols verbatim but moved with a hesitant uncertainty, their hands lacking the muscle memory that only comes from relentless, realistic training. On her third day, she approached the chief medical officer, Captain Davies, a young, eager doctor barely out of his residency. "Captain," Eva began, her tone collaborative, "I've been looking at the layout. If we were to get hit with a multi-casualty incident from a complex attack, our flow would be compromised. I'd suggest we move the rapid infusers and hemorrhage control kits to open shelves next to bays 1 and 2 and clear this area for triage." Davies gave her a tight, polite smile. He adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit. "I appreciate the input, Captain Rostova, but our current configuration was personally approved by Colonel Thorne. He values order and adherence to regulations. Everything is exactly where the official doctrine says it should be. It looks good for the reports." "A Maskell doesn't care about reports," Eva said, her voice remaining soft. "And we haven't had a Maskell in over 6 months. Davies countered, his tone hardening slightly. "The Colonel's deterrence patrols are working. We're in a quiet sector." Eva didn't push. She simply nodded and walked away. She had seen too many quiet sectors explode into chaos. She knew that peace was a fragile illusion, and readiness was the only thing that was real. Instead of arguing, she began her own quiet preparations. She took the section of the supply room assigned to her and reorganized it for brutal efficiency. She assembled 3 go bags herself, packing them with tourniquets, pressure dressings, and airway kits, and stashed them under a gurney where they were accessible but out of sight. She spent her evenings observing the medics, noting who was quick with their hands and who was easily flustered. Her quiet diligence did not go unnoticed by everyone. Master Sergeant Elias Vance, the FOB's senior enlisted leader, was a man who had seen enough to measure a soldier by their actions, not their rank or their words. He was built like a retired linebacker, with a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather. He often stood in the background, watching. He saw Eva running laps around the FOB's perimeter in the crushing heat of midday when everyone else was seeking shade. He saw her in the motor pool talking to the mechanics, learning the specific vulnerabilities of their MRAPs. And he saw her in the aid station, long after her shift had ended, methodically field stripping and cleaning surgical instruments that were already supposed to be sterile. One afternoon, Vance watched as the medics ran a casualty drill. It was a choreographed, bloodless affair. Lieutenant Miller, one of Thorne's eager young protégés, stood by with a clipboard, ticking boxes. The scenario was a single soldier with a simulated gunshot wound to the leg. The medics moved with a stilted slowness, calling out steps as if for an exam. "Applying tourniquet," one of them announced, wrapping it loosely around the mannequin's thigh. Miller made a check mark. "Excellent. Time to application, 45 seconds. Well within standard." From across the room, Eva watched. She didn't say a word, but her focus was so intense it was almost a physical presence. When the drill was over and Miller was congratulating the team, she walked over to the mannequin. She tested the tourniquet with 2 fingers. It was limp, easily shifted. It wouldn't have stopped a nosebleed, let alone an arterial spurt. She looked up and her eyes met Vance's. He had seen it too. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Later that day, he found her by the aid station's back entrance, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains. "Heard the drill went well," Vance said, his voice a low rumble. "Another green metric for the colonel's morning brief." "The tourniquet was cosmetic," Eva replied, not looking at him. "In a real situation, that soldier would have bled out on the floor while they waited for a pat on the back." "I know," Vance said. He leaned against the wall beside her. "The colonel likes his paperwork clean. He thinks if the slides are green, the men are safe." "Green slides don't plug bullet holes," she said. "No, ma'am, they don't." He was quiet for a moment. "I ran a background check when you arrived. Standard procedure for senior staff." Eva finally turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were gray, the color of a winter sky, and held no surprise. "Your file is thin," Vance continued. "Unusually thin for a captain. Says you commissioned late. Army Nurse Corps, Walter Reed, a few standard assignments. Nothing that explains why you move like you're expecting trouble from every shadow. Does it matter what's in the file, Master Sergeant?" "It matters if the people in charge are reading the wrong map," he said. "And right now, the colonel is navigating by a tourist brochure." He pushed himself off the wall. "Just be ready, Captain. This valley has a way of reminding people that it's not a quiet sector." Eva watched him walk away, his large frame silhouetted against the deepening twilight. She turned her gaze back to the mountains. The calm was deceptive. It was the stillness of a predator, coiled and waiting. And in the pristine, orderly aid station behind her, she felt like the only one who could hear it breathing. The pressure continued to build in subtle ways. A soldier came in with a severe infection from a cut he'd ignored for a week, afraid that going to sick call for something minor would get him labeled a malingerer. A young private, showing clear signs of combat stress, was prescribed sleep aids by Davies and told to man up by his platoon sergeant, who was just parroting the command philosophy. Eva saw the cracks forming in the foundation of the FOB's readiness, hairline fractures that Thorne's obsession with metrics made him blind to. She documented everything quietly, methodically, building her own set of real-world data. She was an analyst in a nurse's uniform, collecting evidence of a coming failure. She tried one more time. She drafted a proposal for a rigorous bi-weekly maskell drill, one that simulated the chaos and gore of a real event, using moulage kits and unexpected scenarios. She wanted to stress the system, to break it in training so it wouldn't break when it mattered. She submitted it to Captain Davies, who passed it up the chain. The response came back 2 days later in the form of a memo from Colonel Thorne's executive officer. "Proposal for high-intensity trauma drills denied." Current operational tempo does not allow for such disruptions. Task Force Phoenix will continue to adhere to the prescribed quarterly training schedule. Focus on maintaining current supply and equipment readiness levels. Eva read the memo, her face impassive. She folded it neatly and placed it in a folder labeled Command Correspondence. Then she went to her personal locker, pulled out a small, worn medical kit, one that was not on any official inventory, and checked its contents. It was packed for a different kind of war than the one Colonel Thorne was fighting. It was packed for the war that was coming. Came on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon. The sky was a hazy, washed-out blue. The heat had finally broken, and a deceptive breeze was drifting through the FOB. Eva was in the aid station reviewing patient charts. Most of the medics were in the MWR tent, enjoying a rare bit of downtime. The first sound was a deep, guttural whump that vibrated through the concrete floor. It was the unmistakable sound of a large, directed explosion. Close, too close. Before the sound had fully registered, the entire building shuddered violently. Dust and ceiling tiles rained down. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the aid station into a half-light from the setting sun filtering through the grimy windows. The emergency generators kicked in a second later with a roar, and the fluorescent bulbs buzzed back to life, casting a stark, sterile glare on the sudden chaos. The Maskell alarm began to shriek, a piercing, relentless siren that cut through the sudden confusion. Over the comms, a frantic voice screamed, "Contact south. ID. ID. Viper 2-1 is hit. I say again, Viper 2-1 is hit. We are taking small arms fire. We need..." The transmission dissolved into a burst of static and shouting. Eva was already moving. The charts in her hand were forgotten, scattered on the floor. Her movements were fluid, economical, stripped of all hesitation. While Captain Davies was still blinking, trying to process what had happened, Eva was at the supply cabinets. She didn't bother with the key. She snapped the lock with a pry bar she had stashed nearby for this exact purpose. She threw open the doors, pulling out armfuls of battle dressings and chest seals. "Get those gurneys clear," she shouted, her voice slicing through the rising panic. The two junior medics who had been on duty stared at her, wide-eyed. "Now! Triage area here." She kicked an administrative desk out of the way with a grunt, the metal legs screeching across the floor. The first casualties arrived minutes later, a tidal wave of blood and agony. They came on litters, carried by soldiers whose faces were smeared with soot and terror. The doors of the aid station were thrown open, and the war poured in. It was the crew from the MRAP Viper 2-1. The vehicle had been torn open like a can. The injuries were devastating. A driver with bilateral leg amputations, his life held in place by hastily applied tourniquets. A gunner with severe facial burns and a compromised airway. A young infantryman with shrapnel peppering his chest and abdomen, his breathing shallow and wet. The aid station descended into chaos. The handful of medics on duty were immediately overwhelmed. They were trying to follow their neat, orderly drills in a situation that defied order. Captain Davies stood in the middle of the room, shouting contradictory instructions, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Get me vitals on that one. No, wait. Start a line on the burns victim. Where are the large-bore IVs?" Colonel Thorne burst in, flanked by his XO and Lieutenant Miller. He wasn't there to help. He was there to manage, to control a situation that was spiraling out of his grasp. "Status report, Davies. What do you have?" he barked, his presence adding another layer of pressure and confusion to the room. He pointed at the soldier with the amputations, who was bleeding profusely from his left stump, the tourniquet having slipped in transit. "Medic, control that bleeding. Now, that is a direct order." The young medic, barely 20 years old, fumbled with a pressure dressing, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't open the packaging. The soldier on the gurney was crashing, his one remaining eye rolling back in his head. That was the moment Eva took over. She moved with the lethal grace of a predator. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her command was absolute. conveyed in her posture, her actions, her unshakable focus. She strode over to the fumbling medic, took the tourniquet from the soldier's other leg, and with a swift, brutal efficiency, cinched it high on the bleeding stump, twisting the windlass until the flow of bright red blood slowed, then stopped. "Breathe," she said to the terrified medic, her voice low and firm. "Then get me 2 units of whole blood from the fridge. Run." The medic, jolted from his panic, scrambled to obey. Eva turned, her eyes scanning the room, assessing, prioritizing a human triage algorithm. She pointed to the burns victim. "He's losing his airway. Davies, I need to intubate. Get me a 75 tube and a laryngoscope." Davies just stared at her, paralyzed by indecision. We should follow the ABC protocol. His airway is the A in your protocol and it's closing." Eva snapped, her patience gone. She didn't wait. She grabbed the kit herself, tilted the soldier's head back, and with practiced ease, slid the blade into his mouth and the tube into his trachea. She attached a bag valve mask and squeezed, watching his chest rise. "Start a line," she ordered another medic. 2 large-bore IVs. "We're going to need to push fluids." Her voice cut through the noise, a calm, authoritative signal in a storm of static. She moved from patient to patient, a whirlwind of controlled, decisive action. "That's a tension pneumothorax," she said, pointing to the infantryman with the chest wounds. His lips were blue, his breathing almost non-existent. "Give me a 14-gauge needle." A medic handed it to her. Without hesitation, she plunged it into the soldier's chest, just above the 3rd rib. There was a sudden hiss of escaping air, and the man gasped, color returning to his face. The other medics, who had been floundering under Davies' panicked commands, began to gravitate toward her. They recognized true leadership when they saw it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was competent. It was calm. Her orders were simple, direct, and achievable. "You chest tube tray. You pressure bags on the blood. You cut off his gear. We need to find all the bleeding." Colonel Thorne, accustomed to being the loudest voice in any room, found himself suddenly irrelevant. He watched, stunned, as this quiet nurse he had dismissed as a glorified clerk orchestrated the saving of his soldiers' lives with a mastery he had never witnessed. "Captain," Thorne started, trying to reassert his authority. "I need a casualty count for—" Eva didn't even look at him. She looked at Master Sergeant Vance, who had appeared at the door and was quietly directing traffic, keeping unnecessary personnel out. "Vance," she said, her voice carrying easily, "I need security on this door. Only casualties and medics inside. Get the colonel out of my aid station." A collective gasp went through the room. Lieutenant Miller's jaw dropped. To order a full-bird colonel out of any room was unthinkable. To do it in the middle of a crisis was career suicide. Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Captain, you are way out of line." But Vance didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of the colonel, his large frame a solid, immovable barrier. "Sir," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "you heard the captain. They need space to work. Let's coordinate from the TOC. We're just in the way here." He effectively herded the stunned colonel and his entourage out of the aid station, pulling the door shut behind them, leaving Eva and her team in a pocket of controlled, purposeful silence, broken only by the sounds of their work. The takeover was complete. The next hour was a blur of controlled violence. Blood, saline, and sweat mingled on the floor. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of burnt flesh. Eva moved between the 3 most critical patients, a maestro conducting a symphony of trauma care. She directed the insertion of chest tubes, monitored blood transfusions, and performed a rapid surgical cut-down on an ankle to establish in 4 when a patient's veins had collapsed. Her hands, steady and sure, moved with an intelligence of their own, clamping bleeders, dressing wounds, and fighting to keep the flickering flames of life from being extinguished. One patient, the soldier with the abdominal shrapnel wounds, was deteriorating rapidly. His blood pressure was dropping, and his belly was rigid and distended. He was bleeding internally, massively, and the whole blood transfusions weren't enough. "He's not going to make it to Bagram," Davies said, his voice trembling. He was now functioning as Eva's assistant, handing her instruments and trying to keep up. "He needs a surgeon now. He's bleeding out into his abdomen." Eva looked at the monitor. The numbers were grim. "We're not going to wait for a surgeon," she said. She turned to a medic. "Get me the emergency thoracotomy kit." Davies blanched. "What? Captain, we can't do that. That's a last-ditch damage control surgery. We aren't authorized." "I'm not authorized. We don't have a surgeon on this FOB." "I'm authorized," Eva said, her voice flat, leaving no room for argument. She was already pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. "It's called a resuscitative thoracotomy. I'm going to open his chest and cross-clamp his descending aorta. It'll stop the blood flow to his lower body and redirect everything he has left to his heart and brain. It'll buy him an hour." "That's insane," Davies whispered. "The regulations." "The regulations are for situations where you have time to follow them," Eva countered, not looking up. She was painting the soldier's chest with betadine. "Get on the radio to Bagram. Tell them to scramble a surgical team. And tell them call sign Valkyrie is declaring an extreme medical necessity and is initiating Protocol 0-inch. The radio operator, a young specialist named Chun, hesitated. He looked from Eva's blood-spattered face to the pale, shaken visage of Captain Davies. "Mom, I can't use that call sign. It requires 06-level validation on my screen. And I've never even heard of Protocol 0-inch. From the doorway, where he had been silently watching for the past 20 minutes, Colonel Thorne stepped back into the aid station. The fury on his face had been replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. He had heard Eva's command. "What is she talking about, specialist?" Thorne demanded. "What is Valkyrie?" Before Chun could answer, Master Sergeant Vance stepped up behind him. His voice was quiet, but it resonated with authority. "Do what she says, Chin. Access her primary service record. File code is Night Stalker. Read the authorization protocols aloud." Thorne's head snapped toward Vance. "Night Stalker? That's a 160th SOAR designator. What the hell is going on, Master Sergeant?" Chen's fingers flew across the keyboard. A new screen popped up, one with a dark red border and classification warnings. His eyes widened. He read the screen, then read it again, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from the glowing text to the woman across the room, who was now holding a scalpel, poised to cut into a man's chest. Chun turned to Colonel Thorne, his face ashen. "Sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, Captain Rostova's file. It's heavily redacted, but the unclassified summary, she's prior enlisted. Sergeant First Class Eva Rostova. 12 years active duty before commissioning." He took a shaky breath. "She was a Special Operations Combat Medic, assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment. Sir, she has 4 combat deployments with them. The awards list: Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, a Purple Heart." The aid station, already tense, fell into a new kind of silence. The only sounds were the beeping of the monitors and the hiss of an oxygen tank. The medics who had been working feverishly paused, their hands hovering over their patients, and stared at the unassuming nurse who had been commanding them. Chun swallowed hard and continued, his voice cracking. "After commissioning into the Nurse Corps, her file shows she was selected for a special JSOC program. She's a board-certified critical care nurse, but she also holds a flight surgeon equivalency rating and is a graduate of the Special Operations Surgical Team Training course. Sir, the call sign Valkyrie was her unit's designation for her, still active on a contingency basis. The file says, in the event of a mass casualty incident where surgical intervention is required to save life, limb, or eyesight, SFC Rostova, now CPT Rostova, is granted full authority to perform any necessary procedure. Superseding local command authority, it's authorized by a 4-star general at SOCOM. Protocol Zero it's the activation of that authority. The silence that followed was absolute. Colonel Thorne looked as if he had been physically struck. The swagger, the bluster, the unshakable self-confidence. It all evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out man in a clean uniform. He stared at Eva, truly seeing her for the first time. He wasn't looking at a nurse. He was looking at one of the most experienced and decorated combat medics in the entire United States Army. A quiet professional who had spent more time in the crucible of special operations than he had spent behind a desk. His dismissive words, "Keep the Tylenol stocked, Captain," echoed in his own mind, a monument to his own arrogance and ignorance. Lieutenant Miller, who had crept back in, looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The clipboard he was holding slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor. Eva didn't seem to notice the revelation that had just stunned the room. Her focus was absolute. "Scalpel," she said, her hand outstretched. Davies, his own shock momentarily forgotten, slapped the instrument into her palm. With a long, precise incision, Eva Rostova opened the soldier's chest. The medics, who had been following her on instinct, now moved with a new, ferocious purpose. Their fear was replaced by a profound sense of awe and a desperate will not to fail her. They were no longer just medics in an aid station. They were part of something else, a last, desperate stand between a soldier and his death, led by a woman who was more legend than captain. They worked in a seamless, synchronized rhythm, anticipating her needs, handing her instruments, and managing the other patients with a newfound efficiency. Their actions sharpened by the sheer gravity of her presence. Hours bled into one another. The sun set completely, and the aid station became an isolated island of harsh light and intense focus. Eva and her team worked tirelessly, stabilizing the wounded, managing their pain, and preparing them for transport. The soldier on whom she had performed the thoracotomy was alive, his vitals tenuous but stable, his chest now closed with heavy sutures. He was alive because of her. They were all alive because of her. Finally, the thumping beat of rotor blades grew from a distant whisper to a ground-shaking roar. The first Black Hawk medevac swooped down, its landing lights cutting through the darkness. One by one, the stabilized soldiers were carried out into the cool night air. Eva oversaw the handover for each patient, giving a concise, detailed report to the flight medic, her voice hoarse but steady. When the last helicopter lifted off, its red and green lights disappearing into the blackness of the Afghan sky, an exhausted silence descended upon the aid station. It was over. The room was a disaster scene. The floor was slick with blood. Discarded packaging, bloody gauze, and cut-off pieces of uniforms lay in heaps. But it was a quiet disaster. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. The medics began to clean, moving slowly, their faces smudged with dirt and blood. They spoke in low murmurs, occasionally glancing at Eva with a reverence that bordered on fear. Captain Davies was quietly restocking a cabinet, his movements stiff and humbled. Colonel Thorne and his entourage were long gone. Eva stood alone at a large stainless steel sink at the back of the room. She had stripped off her bloody gloves and was methodically scrubbing her hands and forearms, working the soap under her nails, washing away the evidence of the last few hours. She didn't speak to anyone. She just washed, her focus narrowed to the simple cleansing act. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows. Through a small, grimy window, the first hints of dawn were painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and soft pink. A new day was coming. Master Sergeant Vance entered the room, his boots making soft sounds on the linoleum floor. He navigated the debris and walked over to the sink where Eva stood. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply watching her. Then he placed a steaming metal mug on the counter beside her. The smell of strong, black coffee cut through the antiseptic scent of the room. "The flight surgeon from the evac bird radioed," Vance said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Said they've never seen a field thoracotomy done that clean. Said you saved that kid's life. They all made it to the surgical hospital at Bagram. They're all going to make it. Eva turned off the water. She reached for a sterile towel and began to dry her hands with the same meticulous care she had used to save lives. She didn't look at the coffee. She didn't look at Vance. "Good," she said. It was the only word she spoke. "Colonel Thorne is reviewing FOB readiness protocols," Vance added, a note of dark satisfaction in his voice. "Seems he's suddenly very interested in high-intensity maskell drills. He asked me to convey his apologies. And his thanks." Eva tossed the used towel into a bin. She finally turned her head and looked at the master sergeant. Her gray eyes were clear, but held a weariness that went deeper than just one long night. There was no triumph in them, no satisfaction, only the quiet weight of her experience. "The protocols were fine," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They just weren't practiced. People weren't prepared." She turned back to the sink, picked up a blood-caked forceps, and began to scrub it with a small, stiff brush. The simple, repetitive motion seemed to ground her. She was restoring order to her small corner of the world, one instrument at a time. Vance watched her for another moment. He understood. There would be no grand speeches, no victory lap. That wasn't who she was. Her competence wasn't a performance. It was a fundamental part of her being, as natural and as necessary as breathing. Her actions had spoken for her, louder than any commendation or shouted order ever could. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of profound respect from one old soldier to another. "Understood, Captain," he said. He left her there, alone in the quiet aftermath. The rising sun cast a beam of clean, morning light through the window, illuminating the fine scratches on the steel sink and the steady, methodical movement of her hands. She was a ghost no longer. Everyone on FOB Phoenix now knew who Captain Eva Rostova was. But for her, nothing had changed. There was work to be done. There were instruments to clean. And she was, and always would be, ready for the next time the quiet broke.